Hello, my name is Eric Labs, and I'm a senior analyst focusing on naval forces and weapons in the National Security Division at the Congressional Budget Office. I'm going to talk about three issues here today. One is how the Navy's shipbuilding budget fared under the Budget Control Act. Second, what was the Navy's force structure assessment and how did that change from its previous force structure assessment in 2016? And finally, looking at how the Navy will implement that force structure assessment in the course of its 2019 shipbuilding plan and the prospects of achieving a larger fleet that the Navy wants. A fourth topic that is listed here is the role of service life extensions. I'm not going to talk about that topic in a direct set of slides, but it is an issue that is embedded in several of the slides that I'm going to talk about here today. First, let's talk about naval shipbuilding under the Budget Control Act. If you look back at when the Congress passed the Budget Control Act in 2013, you might have expected that there would be serious cuts to the shipbuilding budget that would occur as a result of the implementation of that law. However, as it turns out, the Navy's shipbuilding budget fared quite well under the Budget Control Act era, probably better than almost any other account within the Department of Defense's budget. For the first few years, the shipbuilding budget did not go up very much in the terms of the administration's request, but Congress added money each and every year above the administration's request. And in the last 3 to 4 years, shipbuilding budgets have been rising under the Budget Control Act era, and the Congress has been adding money above the administration's request quite substantially, despite those larger increases for shipbuilding. So, for example, over the entire time period since the Budget Control Act was implemented, Congress increased the Navy's shipbuilding budget at an average of about $2 billion a year. Under the last 3 years, that average was almost $3 billion a year, increased above the administration's request. And what is kind of interesting about those increases in the Navy's shipbuilding account is that has come as a percentage of the Navy's top line. That number has been increasing over the last 3 years. Historically, the Navy gets about 30% of the DoD budget allocated to itself. And of that amount, historically, the Navy has typically allocated about 10% to shipbuilding. But over the last 3 to 4 years, as a result of increases requested by the administration, as well as the additional funds that were put on top of those requests by the Congress, the percentage of the Navy's budget devoted to shipbuilding has increased from around 10% up to around 13% on average, and even getting as high as 15% in 2018. An interesting question going forward for the Navy's ability to implement its shipbuilding plans, which we will talk about shortly, is whether those higher budgets and those higher percentages of the Navy top line, will they persist or will they return to the historical norm? Now, what was bought with that money over the last 6 years under the Budget Control Act period? Well, if you look at the last shipbuilding plan that was put out before the Budget Control Act was passed, that's the Navy's 2012 shipbuilding plan. In that plan, the Navy proposed buying 35 large combat ships and then 54 much smaller, much less expensive small combat ships and support ships. With the congressional action over the last 6 years to increase what the Navy was spending and the number of ships that the Navy was planning to buy under those budgets, the result was that the fleet ended up getting 40 large combat ships and only 47 small combat ships and support ships. So overall, the result of congressional ads and action during the Budget Control Act period was not only more money than might have been expected for the time period, but also a more capable fleet was purchased because more capable ships were being bought than what the Navy had proposed in 2012. Now let's turn to the Navy's force structure assessment. In 2014, the Navy had a force structure assessment that it wanted a fleet size of 308 ships. In 2016, however, with the changing international environment, with the rise of geopolitical competitors in an era of great power competition, the Navy determined that it needed a larger fleet of 355 ships, which it established in its 2016 force structure assessment. That increase of 47 ships between those two force structure assessment was primarily in large surface combatants, cruisers and destroyers, and attack submarines. Those were increased by 16 and 18 respectively. There were other increases as part of that force structure assessment, in a 12th aircraft carrier, for example, and a few amphibious ships and logistics and support ships. But primarily the increases come in large surface combatants and attack submarines. Now, the prospects of the Navy achieving a 355-ship fleet depend very much on how much money it's going to get over the next 30 years to implement that plan. It takes a long time to build a fleet up, and how many ships the Navy is planning to buy with that money. Under the 2017 shipbuilding plan, the last shipbuilding plan that was put out under the old force structure assessment, there was no 2018 shipbuilding plan. The Navy had planned to purchase 254 ships. Under the 2019 shipbuilding plan that was put out earlier this year, the Navy proposed buying 301 ships over the next 30 years, or 47 more than the 2017 plan would have purchased. And again, as it parallels what the Navy's force goals are in its force structure assessment, the largest increases there compared between the two plans were in large surface combatants and attack submarines. Now, that shipbuilding plan to build 301 ships over the next 30 years would not actually build to a 355-ship Navy. It would fall several ships short. The highest point it reaches is 342 ships in the 2030s and 2040s, and then by the end of the period, 2048, it actually falls back to 335 ships. Now, after the Navy put out its shipbuilding plan, it announced in the spring that it was going to extend the service lives of two types of ships, Arleigh Burke destroyers and Los Angeles-class attack submarines. It was going to extend the service life of its destroyers from 35 or 40 years, depending on which model you're talking about, to 45 years. And a handful, 7 to be exact, attack submarines were going to have their service lives extended from 33 to 43 years. Now, that change in the service life of those two types of ships resulted in the Navy being able to achieve a 355-ship fleet around 2033. That is not the exact 355-ship fleet that the Navy proposes in its force structure assessment, but it is a very capable fleet. The 355 ships that the Navy will get with this service life extensions will have much more destroyers and fewer attack submarines than what the force structure assessment calls for, but nonetheless it will be a much larger and much more capable fleet compared to the 285 ships that are in the fleet today. So then the question arises, with that shipbuilding plan and the drive to move towards a 355-ship Navy, how much is this all going to cost? Over the course of the entire 30-year period, the Navy estimates that it's going to cost about $631 billion for new ship construction, or $801 billion under the CBO estimates. That works out to an average of $23 billion a year with the Navy's estimates, and $29 billion a year with the CBO estimates. And that includes all new ship construction that would be in the Navy shipbuilding account, plus various other activities that also must be paid out of that account, such as the refueling of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and the outfitting and delivery of new ships. The question arises, then, what is causing such a large difference between the CBO estimates and the Navy estimates? $6 billion a year is a very substantial difference, and prior estimates of CBO and the Navy on prior shipbuilding plans were not so far apart. The major sources of difference between those estimates are, first, the Navy plans to build a new attack submarine following on the Virginia class, it's starting around 2030. That new attack submarine is going to be much more capable than what the Virginia class is. It's going to be larger, it's going to be faster, it's going to carry more weapons. The Navy shipbuilding plan seems to indicate, by the way how much it assumes that ship would cost, that it would be a slight follow-on to the Virginia class. But in information that came out after the plan was produced, it was clear that the Navy is thinking about a new Seawolf type of submarine, which is a larger submarine that was built by the United States in the 1990s. So as a result, that ship is substantially more expensive in the CBO estimate of the plan than it is in the Navy estimate of the plan. Similarly, the Navy plans to build a new large surface combatant starting in the 2020s, and the estimates in the Navy shipbuilding plan would suggest that it would be not much different or not much more capable than the Arleigh Burke class destroyer. But the Navy plans to use the most up-to-date and available combat systems on this ship, but develop a new hull, a new power system, a larger ship with more space and weight and margin to it. As a result, the CBO estimate for that ship is several $100 million more than the Navy estimate for the new large surface combatant. The new frigate that the Navy plans to start building in 2020 and the follow-on small surface combatant to that ship, the Navy says that that ship is going to cost an average of around $800 to $900 million. But currently, the bids for that ship, the designs that the Navy is considering, range anywhere from 3,000 tons to 6,500 tons for the ship. That's quite a large range for potential new small surface combatant. So what CBO did is we estimated a sort of a midpoint between those two weights, and we priced our ship accordingly. As a result, rather than assuming it was going to be on the low side of that and therefore less expensive, the CBO estimate is a couple $100 million more than the Navy's estimate for the new frigate and the follow-on small surface combatant. Another issue that arises that feeds the differences between the CBO estimates and the Navy estimates in the shipbuilding plan is how successful will the Navy be in executing its new shipbuilding programs. In particular, the Navy plans to build a new ballistic missile submarine starting in 2021. This is a very large ship that is capable of carrying most of the nation's strategic deterrent, and it is a large, complex program that we have not attempted to build in 25 years. So the question becomes, will that program execute on time? Will that program execute on budget? Or if not, then what kind of cost growth might the Navy experience in that? Looking historically, new lead ship programs like that ballistic missile submarine have almost always experienced substantial cost growth, an average of 27% over the last 30 years of new lead ship programs. Some have been more than that, some have been less than that, but they have all been substantial. So CBO assumes that that ballistic missile submarine is not going to come in on budget and that it will cost more than what the Navy is estimating in its shipbuilding plan. Compared to the historical average of how much money was spent on Navy shipbuilding, which was about $16 billion a year, the Navy's 2019 shipbuilding plan is going to be 80% higher in cost than what the historical average is. That represents a substantial requirement for new resources that are going to need to be devoted to shipbuilding each and every year on average over the next 30 years. However, many experts have discussed and are pointing out that we are in a different strategic era than what we have been over the last 20 years or so. We are no longer in the post-Cold War era where the United States is the only dominant power and there is no geopolitical rivals to us. Rather, China and Russia are now posing geopolitical challenges to the United States. So we are in an era of new great power competition. So if you think that that is true, then you have to ask yourself, is including the last 20 years in a historical comparison to what we need to spend in the future, is that an appropriate benchmark? If you therefore think that that is not an appropriate benchmark, what you might want to then compare it to is how much did we spend on naval shipbuilding during the Cold War era? I have data that goes back to 1961 that I can reliably convert to constant dollars in today's dollars. And between 1961 and 1988, the United States spent almost $25 billion a year on naval ship construction. If you look at that comparison, then $29 billion a year may be an appropriate amount to spend on naval ship construction in a new era of great power competition. But the challenge of implementing a large increase in naval ship construction compared to what the Navy has spent recently and sustaining that higher level of spending over 30 years remains. And the biggest challenge comes from the need to replace the Navy's ballistic missile-carrying submarines, its SSBNs, while at the same time buying all of its other ship and aircraft programs. This presentation is largely drawn from two reports CBO published and are available at CBO's website, www.cbo.gov. An analysis of the Navy's fiscal year 2019 shipbuilding plan, published in October 2018, and comparing a 355-ship fleet with smaller naval forces, published in March 2018. If you have any further questions, please contact us here at CBO. Thank you very much.